Sure.
All right, welcome to Hughes Baseball Consulting. I'm Joe Hughes, and it's my privilege to welcome a guest who I've worked with quite a bit in the past. So, Kyle Siemer is on the call today, currently the Assistant Athletics Director for Compliance at Texas Tech University, probably one of the most busiest men in Lubbock. But first and foremost, somebody that I call a friend. But then secondly, also somebody that I can call, that I did call a lot during my time at Texas Tech, mainly to pick his brain and always seemed to have the answer when I needed it when it come to Division One NCAA rules and regulations. So with all the rules out there and such constant change, I don't necessarily know how he keeps up with them all, but he does. And in my opinion, such a valuable resource for anyone to listen to and to learn from, especially the high school baseball player and their families. So when it comes to the recruiting process, in my opinion, it's so crucial to know the rules and especially all the current changes with the landscape of college baseball. So the high school player can, you know, in turn have a full understanding to help them navigate their own journey in their recruiting process. So Kyle, thank you for your time and thanks for jumping on to do a quick Q&A. And before we begin, let's talk a little bit about you. So tell me a little bit about you, your story, background, and how you got to where you're at today.
Sure. Kyle Siemer, Assistant AD for Compliance at Texas Tech. I'm originally from the Denver area. I played baseball for a few years in college. Played junior college ball up in Oregon, and then I was a pitcher at St. Mary's University in San Antonio at the Division II level. Uh, Finished up school back home at University of Colorado. I was actually pre-med, and I was sitting around waitlisted, trying to figure out what I was going to do. I've got an
Yeah.
uncle who's an attorney who went to school with some guys who made careers out of administration in college athletics, and I thought that sounded interesting. So took the LSAT. I got into law school. My wife is from Chicago, so we ended up at the University of Illinois Chicago. And while I was there, I kind of got my start in college athletics with Northern Illinois University. I did 2 years there as an intern while I was in law school. After I graduated, I did 4 years at Montana State University in Bozeman. And then I had an opportunity to move into a senior staff position at Long Beach State. And as a baseball guy, that didn't take much convincing to get me to
Yeah.
make a move to a place like that. So I was there for 3 years, and then I kind of made a local move to the University of Southern California. At that point in my career, the only thing that I didn't have was Power Five experience. So I made that move. I initially worked with baseball and a handful of other sports, but then my last 2 years there, I worked solely with football. And then I came to Lubbock in April of 22, and I worked primarily with football and baseball here at Texas Tech.
That's, man, first of all, I knew you had a really good resume. I didn't know you were that smart though. So that's awesome. And it makes sense why you just, connecting with you and utilizing you as a resource has been so good because you see it from all angles and your experience has put you in that path. So I guess before also a little bit, so compliance in a Division One athletic department, for those of for those people that don't necessarily know what compliance is, what exactly is that?
The best way I can describe it is we help the department mitigate risk. There are a lot of you kind of referenced it, a lot of changing rules. It's kind of like the
Yeah.
tax code for you parents out there. It changes year to year, sometimes on a dime, a lot
Yes.
more frequently on a dime. And so we work primarily with coaches and with student athletes and people kind of affiliated with Texas Tech Athletics to help them kind of navigate the pitfalls that are out there as it pertains to all the different NCAA rules, not just recruiting. Could be scholarships, could be eligibility. There's kind of a lot that goes into it, but I feel like compliance historically has had this sort of stigma as like the cops, like we were looking to bust people or like trying to catch people doing something wrong. But that really couldn't be further from the truth. Like I said, I've got a law background. A lot of people that work in compliance have a background in
Right.
uh, counsel like that. So most of the time, we are just answering questions and advising on how to go about whatever it is you're trying to do in such a way that will get you to where you need to go and kind of keep us out of the newspaper for all the reasons you don't want to be in there. So
That's exactly right. So it's kind of funny because when you mention compliance, everybody thinks no, compliance, it's a bad thing, but I always thought of it as a good thing. Like if you're open and up front with compliance as a coaching from a coaching standpoint, they're there to help you. Everybody wants to win. Everybody's there for the same reason. It's to help the student athlete, right?
Yeah.
So okay, so getting into this, I want you to explain this to me. Like, if I'm a high school sophomore, I'm just kind of coming onto the recruiting scene, I'm needing to learn what I'm getting into. So, baseball wise, there's so many rules, so many regulations. You can't do this, can't do that. So, a little bit about the NCAA recruiting calendar.
Sure.
So walk me through a little bit communication when that begins, and then we can go into some of the different periods, quiet period, dead period, recruiting shutdown, all that stuff.
Sure. So the recruiting calendar is kind of the NCAA's attempt to sort of control and confine recruiting activity to certain types of year, and in some ways to preserve the high school experience for recruits. Before we had all these rules, and particularly like in football, what you were seeing was recruiting happening earlier and earlier,
Yeah,
and the more that that is occupying a young person's high school, career. I don't necessarily know that that's a good thing. Obviously, like starting a relationship and getting to know the coaches that you're going to be signing on with
sure.
sooner and having a longer runway for that, that is very positive. But there is also benefit to like limiting this to like just your junior and senior year.
Hmm. Right.
So communication with prospects in baseball, that starts August 1 of the beginning of their junior year. And
Okay.
that's phone calls, that's text messages, electronic correspondence like email. All of that can start on August 1st. Um, and then when we talk about contact from an NCAA perspective, that isn't necessarily like a text or a phone call. Contact means in person, face to
Yeah.
face,
Okay.
like interaction.
Right.
And September 1 of a prospect's junior year is when they can start taking visits to campus. And we can talk a little bit about official kind of expense
Yeah.
paid versus unofficial. But that's sort of the timeline. It's a little bit different for different sports. Some sports, uh, you can call them starting in most sports, you can call starting June 15th after their sophomore year. In baseball and I believe softball, uh, August 1 um, is kind of the go time for that. And
Yes.
then um, yeah, visits can start in baseball really September 1 of their junior year.
Okay, very cool. So, okay, and you talk about visits, unofficial and official visits. That leads me to just talk through that a little bit. So, you mentioned an official visit is if a coach is recruiting me as an athlete and they want me to come on a visit. What does that entail as far as an official visit?
So an official, think of that as expense paid. That
Okay.
means the institution is providing transportation, lodging, entertainment, meals, things like that. Um,
Yes.
Now a prospect can take an unlimited number of those to different institutions. You can only take one expense paid, like to each institution. There's some exceptions, like if there's a coaching change or things like
Right.
that. But
Right. It
it
used
used
to
to be
be
you were limited
five.
to five. Yeah, it
Right.
used to be you
Okay.
can only take five
It's
OVs
crazy
in your
now.
high school
Yes.
career. Um, and schools are limited by the number of official visits they can host.
Right.
Although I think
Okay.
we're probably heading to a place where because prospects can take unlimited, like in football, for example, they you used to be able to only take 70 official visits or
Hmm.
host 70 official visits as an institution in a given year. This year they're going to be able to take unlimited or
Oh, wow.
host unlimited.
Okay. So baseball usually follows suit. Usually, if football does something a lot of times down the road, baseball typically does as well.
Correct. But so like each institution is limited in the number of official visits they can host.
Okay, that
But as
makes
a prospect, I could take one to as many schools that are willing to host me on one.
pretty good if you're a high school baseball player and you're getting
Yeah.
invited everywhere. Okay.
And we're talking about like 2 nights. So usually
Yeah.
like that's the limit. There's some exceptions, like if you get in too late for like an additional night, but it's not like a week long deal.
Right.
Um, you're kind of confined. We can, as an institution, we can pay for 2 nights of lodging.
Okay.
We can pay for transportation for the prospect and up to two family members. And then once they get here, we can provide entertainment and like meal stuff for the prospect and up to four family members. So if they wanted to bring like
Okay.
additional people with them on their visit. Um, it's basically prospect plus four.
Very cool.
But there's some restrictions as far as what we can pay for, the number of people that we can pay for, as far as like
Yeah.
transportation, flying them to get them here. That really recently changed. In baseball, you were only able to pay for the prospect until pretty recently. So now they've brought it more in line like with football and basketball, to where we can pay for at least two parents to fly
Very
here.
cool. Yeah, absolutely. And that makes sense, right? If you're bringing the family out, you want to be able to take care of them if you're a school.
Yep.
Well, cool. Okay, so you mentioned we talked about official, now unofficial. So what's the difference there?
So unofficial, that is like non-expense paid. That means the prospect is paying for everything themselves. They're paying their own way to get to campus. There's less restrictions on that. You still cannot. You used to be able to take an unofficial whenever you felt like it.
Yeah.
Now it is September 1 of their junior year, and then we also got to be mindful of. You kind of referenced the recruiting calendar. As long as it's not a dead period or a recruiting shutdown. So
Yes.
so a quiet period is a period of time up on the recruiting calendar when we can host. There's no off-campus recruiting, meaning relative to our coaches. So they can't leave Lubbock to
Right.
go
Okay.
recruit. But we could bring recruits to campus to have visits during a quiet period.
Very
Um,
good. Okay.
the other periods we have are contacts. So that's mainly when coaches can go out. They can go visit high schools. They can go watch tournaments, watch high school games, things like that. And then a dead period is a period of time during the recruiting calendar when you can't have any on or off campus recruiting activity.
Okay.
So no visits could happen. You couldn't leave, coaches couldn't leave campus to go watch things. Phone calls, text messages, emails, all that stuff is still okay during a dead period.
Right.
You just couldn't, coach couldn't go watch a high school game, recruit couldn't come to campus on an official or an unofficial visit. And then now in baseball, we've got recruiting shutdowns, and that
Yeah.
is when you can't do anything. You can't do no on or off campus contact, and then no correspondence of any kind either.
Right.
No
And this
text messages, no phone calls.
those those are geared typically around maybe holidays,
Correct. Yep. So
right?
in baseball, the recruiting shutdown is really around
Holiday,
Thanksgiving
usually
and then
Thanksgiving,
Christmas.
Christmas, and then maybe one more. Is there one more? I think during Father's Day, or maybe that's just a dead period.
That's dead. So
That's
right
dead period.
now the
Okay.
the
Yeah.
uh, shutdowns are November 26th through December 1st. So basically a
Yeah.
week from today. Um, you got a week of dead or of shutdown, and then the December 22nd through the 27th is another recruiting
Very
shutdown.
cool. Very cool.
So if I'm a recruit and I call a coach and they don't respond to me over that
That,
period of time,
that's why.
it, that's why.
That makes sense. Okay. Well, very cool. Well, that's all really good info. So, okay, I'm thinking back as I was a college coach and I was in the coach's shoes. There's so many times where I start talking to a kid, recruiting a kid, and speaking of visits, you want to get them out to campus, right? And so the first thing I would do, not one of the first things, but one of the first things to get his visit lined up, I would ask him for his NCAA ID number. And half the time, or most of the time, honestly, kids just they didn't know what that was. And it's such a simple process and such a simple step. But so talk about the eligibility NCAA eligibility center and what an ID number is, what that's for.
Sure. So when you and I were playing, it was called the Clearinghouse. A lot of
Yep.
people know it as the NCAA Clearinghouse. Now it's called the NCAA Eligibility Center. And really, every student athlete in any sport who competes in college athletics at the NCAA level has to go through the NCAA Eligibility Center in some form or fashion. And eligibility is really just the determination that you have met some objective standards that everyone has agreed upon in order to participate in college athletics.
Okay.
So there's initial and continuing eligibility. I'm not really going to talk about continuing
Sure.
eligibility, but the eligibility center deals with initial eligibility.
Hmm.
They're really looking at two areas. So academics and then amateurism. So I'll
Okay.
start with amateurism because I think it's a little bit easier, but they basically want to confirm that you have not professionalized in the sport that
Okay.
we're talking about. So people who have professionalized, people who have been compensated for performing a sport, they're no longer eligible to compete and then represent NCAA institutions in intercollegiate competition. So they'll ask you questions like, what teams did you play for? Have you ever been drafted? Did you sign a contract? Did you get
Right.
paid? Do you have an advisor? Things like that.
Right.
that's what they're looking at from an amateurism perspective. I should probably back up. So everyone needs to register with the Eligibility Center.
Hmm.
These days, the $100 registration fee for domestic kids. I think it's 160 for internationals.
Okay.
Um, there are some criteria to qualify for a fee waiver. So like there's some steps that you can follow on the Eligibility Center to maybe avoid having to pay that.
Yeah.
Um, but you want to choose if you're when you're signing up for the first time. There's a couple options. Really, the one you want to choose for most cases is academic and amateurism certification account. I think there's another one for international, and there's another one for like a free one if you're just looking to go Division 3.
Okay. That makes
But for
sense.
the most
Yeah.
part, like for the folks that we're talking about, they're going to need to do the academic and amateurism certification account.
Okay.
So um, somebody at the NCAA Eligibility Center, somebody at the NCAA is going to need to take a look um, at all of their stuff. So,
Right.
like I kind of alluded to, academics is really the other piece of that, and the requirements that they have in place are really designed to make sure that you're up to the task of doing this thing. So, playing college baseball on
Yes.
top of the collegiate academic workload. So, they're kind of looking at there's three things that you need in order to be eligible. So, high school graduation, obviously,
Yep.
NCAA eligibility, and then college admission. So, like whatever school we're talking about, they got to admit you just like any other student.
Perfect.
The eligibility center is kind of looking at your NCAA eligibility. So
Yeah.
they're going to be looking at a few things. So core courses,
Hmm.
um, GPA, and then kind of timeline. So your
Okay.
courses, and thankfully here at Texas Tech, we have somebody that handles this. Every other school I've worked at, this plays a big role in kind of compliance, like just sort
Yeah.
of that analysis of where someone's at, if they're going to be a qualifier or not. I'll talk about that here in a minute. But
Right.
as far as core courses go, um, they're looking at your entire high school like body of work, but they're really
Mhm.
focusing on did you get 4 years of English? Did you get 3 years of math? 2 years of science? One additional year of any one of those three?
Right.
2 years of social science, and then 4 years of anything that counts as a core course per that high school's list of core courses. So
Okay.
every high school
Yeah.
registers with the Eligibility Center, uh, and some classes count, some classes don't. Like gym classes typically are not counting towards
Yeah.
core courses. Um, the next thing is timeline. So there's what's called a 10-7 rule. So that's 16 core courses. And there's a rule on top of that that says you have to complete 10 of those 16 before your seventh semester, which is your senior year.
Okay.
So you have to get 10 of those 16 done. The reason for that is they don't want you to like wait until your senior year to decide to get eligible.
Makes
Uh,
sense. Yeah. Get
so
ahead, right?
that's that for the most part. If people stick to like their normal high school graduation timeline, you're going to satisfy this pretty
Right.
easily.
And
Uh,
academic counselors in high school should be able to help the high school kid and get them on path as long as they're staying proactive, making sure they're getting their core classes. And I
yep,
always considered it, and I don't mean to jump in, but I always considered it like a tracker, right? It's
mhm,
basically your tracker to see if you're on path and you're eligible to play for
yep.
college baseball, right?
And then core course GPA. So
Okay.
um, looking at just your GPA in just those courses that we're talking about, not necessarily
Yeah.
your total high school GPA, but your GPA in those classes, in those courses that we're looking
Okay.
at. Um, so all of that will combine to determine if you're a qualifier or a non-qualifier. I left out test score because that's no longer a requirement. It used to
Right.
be like when we played, it was a combination of GPA plus whatever your test score was. It used to be called a sliding scale. So if you got a lower
Yes.
GPA, you could get a higher test score and become a qualifier. That's out the window now. They're just looking at core courses, GPA, and that timeline.
Yeah.
Um, I'll talk a little bit about test score here in a second, but
Okay.
um, qualifier versus non-qual. So all of that's going to determine if you're going to be a qualifier or not. You want to be a qualifier. If you're a qualifier,
Okay.
as determined by the Eligibility Center, you're going to be eligible to receive financial aid, so receive a scholarship, eligible to practice, and eligible to compete in your
Okay.
first year. If you are a non-qualifier, you're not eligible to do any of those things until you serve what's called an academic year in residence. So you basically
Hmm.
get a city year if you are a non-qualifier. There's actually another option. So an academic red shirt is relatively new, but that's if you meet all of those requirements but your GPA is below a 2.3 and above a
Okay.
2.0, you could become what's called an academic redshirt. You're still
Okay.
eligible to receive a scholarship. You're still eligible to practice, but you're not going to be eligible to compete in that your first year at that.
First year, the spring semester. Okay.
It's kind of
Freshman,
like it's
basically.
kind of like a forced redshirt,
Okay.
but at
Now,
least you're still able to get a scholarship and you're still able to like
okay.
be a part
Now,
of the team.
alternatives, if they are not a qualifier, they can go junior college or NAIA, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
And if you're a non-qualifier and you go to a junior college, um, that's
You
what a lot of people do, but there are still some additional requirements on top of
graduate, all yeah.
yeah, you got to
Yeah.
graduate, you got to have a certain GPA leaving the junior college in
Yes.
order to get eligible at a 4-year school. But and then there's also something called an early academic qualifier. So
Okay.
if you looking just at your pre-senior year record, if you've completed 14 core courses and you've got above a 3.0, they'll make you a qualifier before your senior year even
Okay.
starts. So
Okay. So grades matter,
they
right?
do. So that the GPA, you need a 2.3. At a place like Texas Tech, scholarships, other academic scholarships can
Yeah,
be
they
had
matter.
based on test score and based on GPA. So
Right.
um, test scores, again, not really a factor anymore as far as NCAA initial eligibility, but it can matter for kind of two reasons. And one is admissions for whatever school that we're talking about.
Yeah.
Different institutions have different requirements. You might be able to get in easier based on a test score, and then academic aid can be available based on the test score that you
Perfect.
score.
The more
Um,
options to receive scholarship. So
yeah,
that's 100% a good reason to have good grades.
yes.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, that's good. So any more on academics? Feel good there. That's
Uh,
info
I
and that's
don't know
good
that there's
info.
anything else that I'm
No, that's
qualified to
great.
answer about, but
Well,
that's sort of
cool.
the, the down and dirty of kind of
Yes.
how it looks as you approach
Yeah.
graduation and getting eligible to compete at the college level.
That's great, man. Well, that's perfect. Well, okay, so going into that, so this is something that you just went through pretty recently with baseball, and then you actually shared with me you're getting ready to go through with football. So signing day. So this is in college baseball, one, it's a time to celebrate. It's such a fun time, but there's some different things that are going on with it right now. And I'll let you discuss what's going on, but there used to be the National Letter of Intent. That's no more. So what are some of the things that go into signing day and rules and, everything that high school kids should expect?
Sure. Um, so you just mentioned there's no more NLI or National Letter of Intent.
Hmm?
Previously, you had to sign. You couldn't sign just a National Letter of Intent. It always was accompanied by what's called an athletic scholarship agreement.
Yeah.
Now you would sign just an athletic scholarship agreement, and some of the terms that were in the National Letter of Intent um, have been folded into or should be folded into each institution's athletic scholarship agreement. So
Okay.
once you sign an NLI or an ASA, like previous, it's kind of the same rules now, but that school would mark you as signed either in the
Mhm.
eligibility center or in the transfer portal. And then a recruiting contact prohibition would go into effect. So this used to be called the recruiting ban.
Right.
Any communication between staff at another school and a signed recruit or their family would be a level 3 violation. So the idea there being this is a step that sort of is supposed to stop the recruiting process for
Yes.
you, kind of take you off the board, and other coaches are supposed to leave you alone.
Yep.
Uh,
Something
as
as
a
a coach is a big no-no. Big
Yeah,
no-no. Yeah.
yeah, and as a college coach, like you want to know that like, all right, I'm done recruiting. Like I don't have to worry about you know
Yeah,
that
they're coming.
position
They've signed the
anymore.
paper. They're
We know
coming.
they're coming, like
Yeah.
because it's a bad position to put somebody in to where like, okay, I know I signed with you, but I changed my mind. I want to go to this school now, and it's
Hmm.
the week before school starts, and as a coach now I got to go find somebody to replace that individual.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
So, like I said, no more NLI, but we do still have that first permissible signing date. So a signing day for athletic scholarship agreements. So, like I said, previously you would sign an NLI and an ASA. Now it's just an NLI or just an ASA. An NLI was kind of a two-way agreement
Hmm.
between for the recruit to attend that school for one academic year and for that school to provide them a scholarship for 1 year.
Yes.
Now, and then an athletic scholarship agreement was always signed alongside that. If in fact an NLI wasn't valid unless it had a scholarship with it, but now you just sign that athletic scholarship, and it
Okay.
functions essentially the same.
It's pretty similar and is how, and this might be a question you can or can't answer because it's still evolving, but how binding is the athletic scholarship agreement to the
It's
student
not
and the
it's
college?
not as binding as an NLI was.
Right.
Yeah. So
Okay.
you technically um, you could sign an NLI with an institute or with sign an ASA with an institution and not show up there. You
This is
couldn't
crazy.
you couldn't
Yeah.
permissibly have conversations with other coaches. Like
Yeah.
you could ask the school, "Hey, I changed my mind. I don't let me out of my the scholarship that I signed," and they have to either let you out or not and give you a chance to appeal it, which is kind of what you used to have to do with an NLI. But say you didn't do that. Say you sign with somebody and you either never ask them to be let out of it or you ask and they say no. You still could go to another institution and be eligible as long as you didn't have any conversations with anybody at that, as long as no recruiting took place.
That's
We've seen
wild.
that
Yes,
lately.
that's crazy. Okay.
You kind of seen that even before now because we have these windows, these transfer portal windows, and
Right.
somebody might get in the portal outside of a window because of circumstances, like just whenever they got their scholarship taken away or whatever the coach let, things like that. So they might not have gotten in the portal or not have been able to get in the portal in the appropriate window that they need to in order to be eligible. But that's not stopping them from transferring
Right.
to another
Right.
institution. They're just turning up um, at that school and, you know,
Yeah, it's crazy, man. Times are
yeah,
changing, and that's one of the things that's changing, right? So NLI to athletic scholarship agreement. Um, but there's so many other things that are changing in college baseball, and this, in my opinion, is so important for the high school player to know, and their parents and families to know, because it's affecting the high school player. Like I think there's such a trickle down effect right now going on for the 2025s, 2026, and then who knows how long it's gonna just it's gonna affect the high school kid when it comes to the recruiting process
yeah.
because there's changes going on, and I'll let you talk a little bit about them. The roster limits, the scholarship limits, going hand in hand with the NIL programming. Oh, and then by the way, you have a transfer portal that is wild right now. So I'll let you. So what are some of the changes that high school players and their families should be aware of?
The big one, probably the biggest one, is the roster
Yeah.
cap as a result of the House settlement. So this year, roster limit, baseball was one of the rare sports that had a limit previously. So in some ways, baseball will be the least affected by this, but the number is less than it
Yes.
was. And what that means is there's less opportunities at the Division One
Right.
level. That means every team's got five less spots. So this year, well, probably more than that, but this year roster limit actually increased from 35 to 40. So this
Yeah.
year schools could have 40 people on their roster as of the first game.
For the
And
spring of 2025, right?
correct.
You have 40. Okay. Yes.
But for 25, 26, all Division One schools will be limited to 34.
So
Uh,
40 down to 34. So six
correct.
less per every Division One roster,
Yep.
which
And
is,
every sport across the NCAA is facing these. Some of them,
yeah,
they're not as impacted.
right.
But like football's losing 20. You know,
Okay. Okay.
football like they actually don't have limits right now, but their limit will be 105. So like if
Wow.
we have 122, like that's 17 people that we can't have on our
They have
roster.
to find somewhere else to play.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
So
This
in
can impact.
baseball, you're
Yeah.
going from 40 to 34. Um, and it's sounding like that requirement will be as of the first competition, but it could be the first day of the semester. It could be a certain
Okay.
date in within the semester. We still have a lot of questions to be answered, um, and then scholarship limits. So right, baseball famously 11.7 scholarships. It's kind of a common misunderstanding, at least lately, that everyone's going to be a full scholarship. We currently have what we call head count sports, where you get X number of scholarships, and if you get any athletic aid, you count. So those are typically the maximum amount that we can give them, which is full cost of attendance. So like in volleyball, they get a limit of 12 counters. Um, they could have 12 different people on scholarships, and those 12 generally in the head count sports would
Okay.
receive that maximum cost of attendance that an institution could give them. Scholarship is tuition fees, room, board, books, and then other elements,
Okay.
or miscellaneous, or some schools refer to it as the cost of attendance. It used to be like, I don't know, how many years ago was that? Probably 10 years ago now. A
Yeah.
scholarship could just be tuition and fees, room, board, and
Yep.
books. And
Yeah.
then they added that other miscellaneous cost of attendance
Right.
element, which
Not too
varied from
long ago.
school to school. It could
Yeah.
be, $6,000 here. It might be $9,000 at like a Stanford, a place like that. So
Okay.
um, alternative to head counts, we have equivalency teams, which is what baseball
Okay.
historically has been. That means there's a scholarship limit, and we can give out athletic scholarships up to the equivalent of that limit. So in baseball, 11.7 scholarships, we can chop those up. We could give somebody a half or a third or 25%, as many as we want to. Baseball has also had counter limits. So
Yeah.
this year,
Another thing that people just don't understand,
yeah,
right? Yeah.
baseball's kind of a hybrid of head count and equivalency, to be honest, because uh, we have we've had minimums as well, so you couldn't give somebody less than 25%
Yep.
in
Yep.
baseball. You couldn't give a scholarship out to more than it's 32 this year, but 27 typically different people could get a scholarship in baseball. After the House settlement and after all these roster caps, we really won't have the concept of head count sports. Will
Mm.
Everyone will be an equivalency sport um, with roster caps. So that's not to say that the current scholarship limits don't matter. So baseball did go from 11.7 to 34, really. But there are Title IX implications to giving out more scholarships. Basically, any additional male scholarships have to be offset by female scholarships. And then any additional scholarships kind of over the current limit will count against revenue sharing. So we
Okay.
have a bucket of scholarship money and we have a bucket of revenue sharing money after this House settlement goes into effect. That'll effectively become institutional NIL,
Right.
which currently we're not allowed to issue. But that revenue sharing is tied to actual revenue generation. So, like your footballs and your basketballs, and to a
Hmm.
lesser degree, baseball, to an even lesser degree, every other sport.
Right.
So, if a school decides we don't just want to give 11.7, we want to give 15 scholarships now,
Yeah.
that's 3.3 additional scholarships that they need to also give in a women's sport. And that's a
Uh,
say let's say a scholarship is $30,000. That's another 99,000, say $100,000. That is coming off the top of the revenue sharing. So that's less money for football and for basketball to be given out by that institution. A lot of questions in this
yes.
area. We are still trying to kind of navigate, but
And so is every school. And so I think
yep.
the general conception out there is everybody's thinking that, hey, baseball, every school is going to have 34 scholarships. My son's going to be on a full ride if they go Division 1 for a Power Four. But that's not the case. I don't see many, if any, going above 11.7. Some of the bigger schools might, but I don't know that anybody's truly going to get to 34 because that's money. It's money out of the athletic department's pocket, right? That they can be putting towards football, towards basketball, the revenue generating sports.
Some like the SEC, I know has implemented a internal, like within the conference scholarship limit.
Okay.
You're going to see you're going to see conferences do that. So
Yeah.
uh, in baseball in the SEC, their scholarship limit agreed upon within that conference is going to be either 25 or 24.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
even if you wanted to give more scholarships than that, now it's also like a combination of scholarship plus um, revenue sharing or
Right.
NIL.
Plus NIL. Right.
All
Yeah.
of that kind of is money that can be used to pay for going to school, right?
That you can
Um,
supplement to make it a full package type deal, right?
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and like certain things don't count. Like revenue sharing is not going to necessarily count against your 11.7, which we do still have to kind of worry about. But honestly, the schools that are going to be in the best position are going to be the schools where baseball makes up a larger proportion of the revenue sharing within that athletic
Yeah.
department.
Okay. That
So,
makes sense. That
so
makes
the
sense.
schools where you can say like, yes, baseball's revenue sharing is, 15% of an athletic department's budget. That's an enormous number relative to football or relative to everybody else. They're going to have a bigger pool of revenue sharing money to play with.
Okay.
So
Interesting. That's all interesting stuff.
yeah,
It's so crazy because again, so many changes. And again, I don't know how you keep up with all this, but it's really impressive. And I know just from being pretty closely tied with it, a lot of this could change tomorrow
yeah,
or could change by this time next year. So it's
that's the
always
hardest part. Is it used
right.
to be like, hey, this is an idea. Let's talk about it. 6 months later, maybe we vote on it.
Yeah,
Maybe it passes, and then it's into effect next year. Now it's like, hey, coach, this changed today.
today.
You know,
I remember those
this,
conversations with you. Yes,
and
absolutely.
this is what it means.
Yes.
It's just kind of
Okay.
being nimble.
Well, okay, so I mentioned earlier, so those changes are getting ready to impact college
Mhm.
baseball. So the current thing that's been going on, and it's just getting crazy, is the transfer portal. And that's
Mhm.
tremendously impacting college athletics and college baseball.
Yep.
So obviously stuff with that's changed recently. So can you talk to that a little bit about the transfer portal?
Yeah. So in baseball and football and hockey and basketball used to kind of all be in the same boat, and there was really not a way to transfer and be immediately eligible in those sports. If you were transferring in the sport of baseball, you were resigning yourself to sitting a year.
Right.
Now they've done away with that, so you could transfer and be immediately eligible in any of those sports. Um, there's always some exceptions, like a grad transfer wouldn't have to sit and things like
Yeah.
that.
Right.
But they've removed a lot of the restrictions. Well, courts, I should say, have removed a lot of
Yes.
the restrictions
Yes.
as they pertain to transferring. So now there's really not a limit to the number of times you can transfer and be eligible,
Okay.
at least from a
Okay.
transfer perspective. So
Yeah.
there's transfer requirements, and then there's obviously eligibility, academic requirements at
Right.
whatever different institution you're transferring to. But
So,
um,
and do the academics, do they vary from school to school based on
they do,
probably
and
what
then
is transfer, what don't?
yeah. So I kind of mentioned there's initial eligibility, and then there's continuing eligibility. So there's
Yes.
some requirements each
Yeah.
semester that you need to meet in order to be eligible. Those kind of change um, over the course of your college career. Like
Yeah.
basically the more semesters you have under your belt, the more hours you're going to need to
That makes
have that are degree applicable. The idea being you're working towards graduation in a reasonable time period. Another thing probably worth mentioning is that there's red shirts, there's medical hardships and things like that. It sounds like the direction that the NCAA membership is heading is this sort of concept of 5 years to play five.
okay.
That's not official yet, but that is in discussion. It's been in discussion for kind of a while now, and that essentially would mean you have a 5 year period of clock and you can play up to 5 years there, and we're not going to mess with granting clock extensions or hardships or anything like that. But
Wild. Yeah. That's crazy. Well, that's good info. So that's all very important to know because again, transfers can come into Division One, so less rosters and they can get the older experienced player now because it's unlimited transfers. So the high
mhm,
school player needs to understand that hey, Division One is getting harder and harder to play. So okay, so moving forward from that, this is always a tricky one. This is always something that um it goes on with high school players into college, into professional baseball, and that's agents and or advisors, right?
mhm,
So as a high school player, I know this has changed too, and this has evolved.
mhm.
There's some do's and don'ts. Like you can have representation, but then you can't at a certain time. So how does that play into college baseball or
Baseball
high
is one
school?
of the rare sports where you can actually have that. And I'll set an aside. You can have NIL agents as well. Like
Yeah.
that's relatively new. Um, current student athletes can have someone who is their NIL agent and they go out and they get them deals. I'm talking strictly about like pro baseball
Yeah.
agent like
Right.
representation.
Right.
Um, and before you get to the college level, before you trigger your clock, so to speak, your 5 year clock, you can use representation. You got to pay the going rate or whatever it is,
Hmm.
and if you get drafted and you don't sign, you basically have to wash your hands of that working
Okay.
relationship.
Yeah.
Uh, a lot of times, like when we take somebody in from a high school level and they were drafted and they ended up not going, we have them sign something that says, "Yes, I understand. Like I was drafted. I use this advisor. Um, we no longer have a
And no more. Yeah. No
no
more
more."
working relationship. Yeah. He does
Yep.
not represent me on really verbally or on paper. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And interestingly, in baseball, what you've seen is like somebody will get drafted from the college level. Um, they might get drafted in kind of a middle round. They could go, they could come back,
Yeah.
and negotiations might break down. And they say, "All right, well, I'm going back to school." And well, the pro team doesn't like that, so they
Yeah.
tip off the NCAA that, "Hey, this guy used an agent while they, while they were supposed to be an
Right.
amateur at the collegiate level." We have seen that recently, not here at Texas Tech, but there have been some guys have had to sit. Guys have lost, a percentage of their season because they thought they could have somebody represent them, and
They didn't sign. They didn't. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, that makes sense. That's wild. And so that's all good info, man. So, well, before we wrap this up, I'm going to throw three questions at you. I hadn't told you these questions, but these are personal questions that just to get some feedback from you, see what you think. So, one, your favorite player. Then two, one piece of advice you'd give a high school baseball player. And then three, what would be your walkout song? So first, who's your favorite baseball player? Do you have one?
like current or
You all time, whatever you want to say. It,
I was a pitcher.
yeah,
Um, I mean, Greg Maddux probably,
yeah,
or
pretty,
Nolan.
yeah. Can't go wrong either.
Like both completely different, but I think hard to overstate how good they were.
No doubt. People, yeah,
Um,
they were both very impressive to say the least. So
if I couldn't pick a pitcher, um, hmm, I like Acuna.
okay, all right, like a little flair to it. I like it, and he's a
I
good
mean, he can
player.
flat play.
Oh, he's a good player. He is the definition of a baseball player. It's
Yeah,
fun. He's fun to watch.
yeah.
Well, that's
So,
good. Okay, so one piece of advice, just off the top of your head, that you'd give a high school baseball player that's getting ready to go through the recruiting process.
um, I guess I would say don't sell yourself short and be willing to, you know, jump at an opportunity that is going to be best for you. You might have something in your head like I'm a,
Yeah.
power forward bust.
Hmm.
You might be able to. I went to a Division II school. A lot of players out there, better than me. Um, and I didn't have all those opportunities to go to a Division I school. But I think there are players that try to go D1 that could get a lot of experience and put themselves in a position to get drafted. Baseball is unique also in that like you kind of have more avenues to like get
Right.
to the professional level than
Yeah.
like so. My other sport is football. There's not that many football opportunities to play professionally. You
Hmm.
know,
Yeah.
there's kind of a lot in baseball. There's a lot of like,
Different
and
avenues, different
you can
routes.
get
Yeah.
to it from anywhere. You don't have to be like a top 25 program, like everyday guy,
Fully
in
agree.
order to do
Yeah.
that. So whether it's JC to develop, you kind of alluded to, like there are going to be less opportunities
Yeah.
at the Division I level. I hate to say it. That's not. I don't get enjoyment out of saying that. Uh,
Reality.
you
Yeah.
talked about the transfer portal. Like if you think a college coach, if they're faced with taking a really good high school kid or taking someone that was a Friday guy in a
Mm.
major conference, like they know what they're getting
Right.
behind door number
Pretty,
two.
pretty cut and
So,
dry. Yeah, experience is key.
you know, um, so I can anticipate, especially with top end programs, to go to that well maybe a little bit more than the traditional high school recruiting. And
Yeah.
people are going to have different experience, different recruiting philosophies and things like that. But all that to say, there's nothing wrong with going junior college. I did the junior college thing,
Yeah.
and there's nothing wrong with going to like Division 2 or going to like a Group of 5 or anything like that. And and in football, we're talking about getting tape. So like you need to get some playing time. You need to get innings in, and you need to be able to show that you can do this at that level. And that 5 year period that we're talking about, that goes pretty quick.
Fast.
Like
Fast.
you'd be
Blink.
shocked. Like
Yes.
we can talk
Blink.
about it, but until it's over, you're like, oh, now I know what they're.
Now you know, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
So don't don't you know don't waste it going somewhere where you're not necessarily going to have an opportunity to
That's
get
good
in
info. Really good advice and 100% agree. All right. So last question of the day, your walkout song.
there, man.
What would it be? Well, I don't want to ask you. Just what would it be? What would your walkout
Like
song be?
today, or what was
Yeah,
it?
today. Today, what would
uh,
it be?
um.
What's your go-to song that you pull on, or it could be just band, artist? Because I
Uh.
don't know that I really know. I just know who I like.
So we had like a staff home run derby thing, like a
Yeah.
staff Olympics,
So you've
and
done this
we had
already.
to pick one there. So like yeah, earlier in the summer, and I did Sturgill Simpson's "Remember to Breathe."
Okay. Okay. Very nice. I won't ask you to sing it.
No,
Well, man, Kyle, it's been an absolute pleasure, absolute honor. And again, that was Kyle Siemer. He's the assistant AD for compliance at Texas Tech University. So, high school players, high school families, I hope you learned something from this. With so many rules and all the constant changes, it's so hard to keep up. So this should at least give you a better understanding of what's going on with all the Division 1 rules and regulations. So educate yourself as much as possible so you know what to expect during your recruiting process. Again, thanks for your time and have a great day. Kyle, thank you.
thank you.